Yeah. Hey. Okay, so I thought I would open us up with prayer and then I'll turn you right on over to Blake. So please join me in prayer if you would. Gracious and loving God, you've splattered the creation today with sunshine after drenching us with rain. We are grateful for the seasons and grateful for your providence. We're grateful for the Church of Jesus Christ. You do large and small things in creation, and we are working on small things that need attention to detail. And we're thankful for Blake that he'll lead us through the amendments to the Constitution today. Send your spirit to us in this strange form in which we meet, that we might be open to your wisdom, leadership, and guidance. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Take it away, Blake.
Okay, let's see if I can do this.
Grandson.
There we go. Okay.
Nice.
So what we have is a proposed amendments to the Book of Order, or to the Constitution, the second part of it, the Book of Order. And what we're going to do today, because there are, as you'll hear me say probably a dozen times, there's 33 amendments that are being made to our, or recommended to be made to our Book of Order. So I'm going to start with those amendments that have been getting more discussion, that have been getting maybe controversial in some instances, and go from there and work our way back. And we will see how far we get in our time together today. I'm going to encourage you as we go, if you have questions, that you raise those as we go, because I want to spend the time where we need to spend the time. And so ask those as we go so that we get clarity on these, because I believe that I have them more or less ranked in an order that would be conducive to that. One of the things that presbyteries are doing with the fact that we have 33 is they're putting, well, they're anywhere from a couple of the amendments on their consent agenda to all 33 amendments on the consent agenda, and then allowing the body to determine for themselves which amendments they want to pull out of that consent agenda for discussion. There are two reasons that I'm not sure that I want to put all 33 on there. I think that looking at the discernment of other presbyteries that have already voted on this, that we can pull some of those out and put a lot on. I have 11 that we potentially will be looking at today, which would leave 22. A lot of those have absolutely no negative votes at this point. Some of those have 32 in favor and 0 against. I'm going to take that those are not the most pressing needs that individuals are seeing. And we will be voting on these amendments at our Presbytery meeting on the 3rd and 4th of March at Lyon College. So before we start, and I see that I have a lot of ministers, but it's never a bad thing to remind us of terminology that we find in the Book of Order, because sometimes some of us don't look in the Book of Order as much as others. I'm one of those weirdos and is constantly in the Book of Order. But we have 4 sections in the Book of Order: the foundations of Presbyterian polity, which basically explain why we do what we do and why we formed ourselves the way we do. And then when you move into a form of government, this is where I think most people, when they come to the Book of Order, find themselves. This is sort of, what does it mean to be a member? What am I supposed to do as an elder? What is the role of a pastor? What can we do at congregational meetings? What do we do about property? All of that. Then we move to the directory for worship, which is all things worship. And probably, hopefully, for many of you, the 4th section, the rules of discipline, is an area that you have not spent a lot of time. I just hope that for all of you. Then in the Book of Order, and this will come in to play throughout our conversation, there are 4 sorts of language that we need to be aware of. One of those is shall, or is to be, or are to be. Those are things that are mandated that we must do. We don't have an option. Should, as you can see, is recommended. Appropriate is suitable, and may is permissible and in no way required. So our first overture that I want to look at today is Overture 22U. And it asks the question, shall W, Directory for Worship 30409, be amended as follows? And this is under the topic of theology of the Lord's Supper. And I just copied the text from the proposed manual. And I've got talking points over here on the right-hand side. Hopefully we can do both and continue to look at the proposed amendment while we're talking through this. The opportunity to eat and drink with Christ is not a right bestowed upon the worthy, but a privilege given to the undeserving who come in faith, repentance, and love. All who come to the table are offered the bread, cup, regardless of their age or understanding. If some of those who come have not yet been baptized, an invitation, when appropriate, to baptismal preparation and baptism should be graciously extended. And I did miss one thing. When you see italics, and we have italics here on when appropriate, what we notice there, that means that that's text that's added. If you ever see text that's been stricken through, that means text that they are going to recommend be taken out of the book of order. So this has generated quite a bit of conversation in presbyteries. So far, we have 30 presbyteries that have voted on this. 19 of those have said yes, that we should amend the book of order this way, and 11 have said no. The reason, and in discussion with other stated clerks throughout the denomination, the concern is that this has a potential to weaken the link between baptism and the Lord's Supper. The book of order already allows for discretion on the part of the pastor with the inclusion of should instead of shall, as we talked about a second ago in our terminology. And there is some concern about the need for baptism before communion. It comes out of G104, which is all of our categories of membership. The first category would be the baptized member, those who were baptized as infants or maybe even as adults, but have not yet joined the church. Then there's a section on other participants and who can participate in what. And the other participants, if you read through that paragraph, you get to a point where it says, with regards to the Lord's Supper, other participants shall be invited or can be invited to participate in the Lord's Supper if they have been baptized. And so that's another place that some of the anxiety is coming from is baptism a necessary first step prior to the Lord's Supper? And I really think that that's where a lot of the 11 negative votes are coming from, is a concern about the role of baptism before one comes to the table. The counter argument to that is that in our emerging generations and new people that are coming to the church, they may wait for baptism until they become a member, or their understanding of belonging / membership is different than our older historic perspective or understanding of that. Are there any questions on this overture, this potential amendment to the Book of Order? Seeing none, we will move to our next one. The next overture is 22-E, and it asks, shall G 20503 in the form of government be amended as follows? And this is the categories of membership for clergy. A minister of the Word and Sacrament is a member of a presbytery and shall be engaged in a ministry validated by that presbytery, a member at large as determined by the presbytery, or honorably retired honorably retired upon request of a member of Presbytery, the Presbytery may designate the member honorably retired because of age or physical or mental disability. You will see that they are striking honorable, and then also because of age or physical or mental disability. Are there any questions on this one as of right now? Okay. Currently, the only designation for a retired minister is honorably retired. But this raises a question about what we do with ministers whose service has been marked by difficulties and challenges which do not rise to the level of formal disciplinary charges or censure, but would not be labeled as honorable. And I'm going to add to the end of that. That's from the Advisory Committee on the Constitution. A question about sometimes in the midst of a judicial case or a remedial case, a pastor is granted retirement. That is a part of the resolution or the remedy to that. And so in those instances, is that pastor truly honorably retired, or are they retired? And the last thing I want to raise real quick is that nothing is in place, nothing, if this passed and we strike honorably retired from the Book of Order, nothing would prevent a presbytery from continuing to have a category of honorably retired. It's just that that would be a slightly separate role that's not mandated that we keep, but we would have those that are honorably retired and those who are retired. Are there any questions on this amendment?
Yeah, Mike, I have one.
Yeah.
If a presbytery were to designate on their own honorably retired, would they then become responsible for determining who is honorably retired and who is not? I mean, is there going to be a group who deems when that's appropriate, when it's not?
I know exactly who that was. That's the troublemaker, Jeff. Okay, so that raises a good question, because what's contained in the proposed amendment does not answer that. And therefore, if you've watched a General Assembly meeting, what often happens is you get a representative from the Advisory Committee on the Constitution that will say, if this raises a question or a concern or is in conflict with another part of the Book of Order, it is up to the Assembly to resolve that. In this instance, I think that would be a presbytery. The council that would really have to determine that would be the presbytery, and it would be up to the presbytery if they wanted to create a subcommittee for retirement versus honorably retired, or whatever, however you want to refer to that. So that's going to be my answer to that question, is that it's yet to be seen. Yes, Karen.
Would you on each of these overtures tell us how many presbyteries have voted in favor and against?
I can give you an update that the most recent update I have is from February the 1st. And on this one, 19 presbyteries have voted in the affirmative and 9 have voted against this.
Thank you.
Yep. And I will continue to kind of give that to you. And just so you know, we have 167 presbyteries. And so what that would mean is that we need 185 is what they're utilizing as their numbers for it to pass. So are there other questions on striking honorably retired from the Book of Order? Okay. Or striking because of age or physical or mental disability. Okay. The next one that I want us to look at is I will go with the 16 presbyteries have voted in the affirmative and 5 have voted against this one. This pertains to terms of call. And so it asks the question, shall G20804 in the form of government be amended as follows? Terms of call. The terms of call shall always meet or exceed any minimum requirements of the presbytery in effect when the call is made. The session shall review annually the minister's terms of calls and shall propose for congregational action such minimum requirements. The call shall include provision for a minimum of 12 weeks paid family medical leave and participation in the benefits plan of the Presbyterian Church USA, including both pension and medical coverage or any successor plan approved by the General Assembly. As you can imagine, the part of the discussion that I had with other stated clerks and other individuals throughout the denomination is that 12 weeks could be problematic for churches, because you're going to have to pay dues on a pastor, pay the pastor's salary for 3 months, while also then having somebody fill that congregation in the absence of their pastor. Then if you were to read through all of the rationale and all of the subtext to this overture, you would see that the amendment does not address the frequency with which 12 weeks is to be offered. And people have raised the question because in the rationale, it gives the life events of a birth, a foster placement, adoption, care for ill or disabled family member, or following a loss or tragic event. And as many of us know, and this was an example that was raised, somebody adopts a child, and then a little bit later, they end up pregnant. So conceivably, and somebody actually proposed this, in the midst of 12 years, somebody could argue they would be eligible for 24 weeks of leave. It could raise questions. And again, I know this one for a fact, it does not explicitly say how often. Is that once during a call? Is that as needed? And so it's unclear how often that is. That once a year or once a call. And since it's unclear, the assembly would be responsible for the clarity. And that would probably be once this gets in the book of order, somebody's going to raise a question, how often, and then, or write an overture to define what that 12 weeks will look like. And it may run through a judicial process, get it all the way to the General Assembly Permanent Judicial Commission, and then they would offer an authoritative interpretation on what is meant by 12 weeks or how often or whatever the issue is with this one. And then it would be resolved potentially that way. Are there any questions or comments on this overture? The next overture for us to look at has to deal with the directory for worship in a section that describes the order of worship and what is appropriate for different sections of a worship service, or what is mandated in different parts of the worship service. So the question before us is, shall this section on confessions and forgiveness in the directory for worship be amended as follows? Other actions may follow: a song of praise such as glory be to the Father or glory to God, a summary of the law or call to faithfulness, the sacrament of baptism, and the sharing of peace as a sign of reconciliation in Christ. What they're adding is the sacrament of baptism. This amendment seems to answer a procedural issue that sometimes happens in congregations. I think we all know to some degree that a response like baptism should be a response to having heard the word sort of like we do with the Lord's Supper, acts of commissioning or other things. But we also know that oftentimes in practice, what we do in churches, toward the front of the service, we do the baptism because everybody's a little nervous and we don't know how well the kid's going to be. Is he going to be cranky as we get past the sermon and things of that sort? And so this is sort of recognizing what I think happens in many congregations in practice. The ACC asked the question as to whether or not this addition would be necessary, because the Book of Order acknowledges baptism ordinarily be in response to the word, but does not require that it only happen after the preaching of the word. This overture has 7 presbyteries, that have voted against it, and 23 that have voted in favor. So you can see that it's almost a 3-to-1, 3 presbyteries in favor for every 1 presbytery that votes against it. Any questions of the intent of this overture? The next overture that we have discusses the form of government and administration of mission. How do we fulfill our responsibility? And so in this case, the question is, shall G 30106 in the form of government be amended that all councils shall adopt and implement a sexual misconduct policy and a child and youth protection policy, and now adding each council's policy shall include requirements for boundary training, which includes the topic of sexual misconduct and child sexual abuse prevention training for its members at least every 36 months. So when it says all councils, that's the session, presbytery, synod, and the General Assembly. So while this is well intended and a good idea, since it's connected to each church, that means that our ruling elders, and depending on how many ruling elders you have and when was the last time that they were on, you may be constantly training or sending people through a training. There is not really any explanation as to what that training would be. It would be up to each council to determine what that training looks like, or what is an approved form of that training. And so the question becomes, could this become cost prohibitive, not only for congregations, but also for congregations? I will pause for 1 moment and say there is an overture that is coming before that all ministers go through boundary training every 36 months. And I know the Presbytery has at the October meeting requested, or we've set that policy in place, that all of our ministers and or commissioned ruling elders serving congregations will be trained in or boundary training every 36 months. So this is just now saying we're going to also require this for elders in the church. Does this also then extend to all the members of the committees? Because if you start thinking about how that would impact every committee, because we're made up of either ministers of word and sacrament and elders, how would that impact a presbytery? How would that impact a synod? How would that impact the General Assembly? Are there questions about this? Yes, Matt.
So is there any requests going with this for the mission agency or OGA or some way to develop resources for this to kind of have an answer to this problem?
There is. It came out of the GA Health, Safety, and Benefits Committee. And that's kind of how it came to the floor. to answer your question, the answer is no. They want that the denomination needs to mandate boundary training and child protection training for all members of councils, including sessions of the congregations, presbytery synods, and general assemblies. So again, it would be up to an individual council. And I would say that in the case of a session, the presbytery would probably help congregations find the boundary training. But the short answer to your question is no.
I just know sometimes they include instructions to develop resources, but that's not here.
We will get to an overture that you will see the administrative, or no, it's not the administrative, the advisory committee on the Constitution has indicated that the Book of Order is not a manual of operations. And that's how they've answered one of the overtures. And if you've been in the denomination long enough, you've watched the Book of Order go from being little to being really big. And then we started shrinking it back so that it was less of a recipe. You will do this, this, and this, in this order, allowing more permission at local levels to determine for themselves how best to implement things. And I think what we're starting to see with some of these, and there are lots of overtures that are asking for policies or things to be put in place, is that the Book of Order, if they did that again, would start to get rather large and lengthy. I have a variety of books of order on my bookshelf, and it's just interesting to watch. You can kind of tell what's going on when the Book of Order was prescriptive and when the Book of Order was descriptive as to what needed to take place. And I think that we're getting back to, I imagine somebody after this would say, okay, General Assembly, this got approved. And so we need guidance as to what that looks like. And there may be ways to meet that on a national level that would supply all councils the ability to get that and have actually the same form of training. This overture, just so you know, has 23 in favor, 3 against. So it's again kind of that 7-1 for every 7 presbyteries that seem to be voting it through. 1 says no. And I really think that the no's are pertaining to implementation, follow through, and how would we implement this requirement, because it would become a requirement. Because you see right there in the first line, all councils shall. So they will have to have something in place addressing this and kind of their repetitive nature. Other questions on this overture? Overture P, again, it's a 7-1. 21 presbyteries in favor, 3 have voted against this proposed amendment. This one asks the question, shall the 4th paragraph, and I'm going to be honest, I did not type out all of the paragraphs. Again, I wanted to try to keep some of my talking points and the actual changes before you, because I know you probably don't all have the entire book of proposed amendments sitting before you and are rapidly running through it. So I just included the paragraph that was up for change, which is the 4th paragraph. All councils shall adopt and implement. Now you see a striking of a sexual misconduct policy and child and youth policy, but the addition of the following policies: a sexual misconduct policy, a harassment policy, a child and youth protection policy, and an anti-racism policy. And there it is, Matt. The Book of Order is not intended to be a manual of operations. That was some of the advice from that advisory committee on the Constitution. So there's a reference, or this amendment is coming from a document, Facing Racism Policy, that was passed. The most recent version was in 2018, which renewed a 1999 version of that document. Again, this is pertaining to that previous policy or overture. It would basically, if you approve that other one, and then you approve this one, you've undone the action on the other one, but have extended that. The part of the argument that we find here is that training isn't enough, but that there needs to be personal and shared outcomes for the policy. Just having that policy in place and an implementation isn't enough. That's what some people are saying. And I think that a lot of the advice from different agencies or different groups within the denomination are speaking to this one, because if these both pass, then this is the one that they need to address. What is not determined is what that harassment policy looks like, or what would be in an anti-racism policy. This one has quite a bit of commentary on it beyond just the background and the rationale. The advisory committee on the Constitution has weighed in. The advisory committee on social witness policy has weighed in. The advisory committee on women's concerns, the racial ethnic advocacy committee, and the General Assembly Committee on Representation have all weighed in on this one. And as I said, 21 in favor, 3 against. Are there questions that you have on what you're seeing before you right now? Yes, Mike.
So all councils, that once again goes all the way down to the session at the local churches?
Yes.
Wow.
So session, Presbytery, General, or Synod and General Assembly would all have to have all of those policies: sexual misconduct, harassment, child and youth protection policy, and an anti-racism policy.
Just a comment, we pass all these things, it's going to make it kind of hard to recruit elders, I think, but
And that may be something to keep in mind when we get to the Presbytery meeting, is implementation of this. Yes, Matt.
How many of these does the presbytery already have in place?
We have sexual misconduct and child and youth protection policy. And our congregations are supposed to have those two in place as well. This basically would be an addition of harassment and anti-racism. Some presbyteries may already have a harassment policy, and I think that we sort of have a de facto, but is it spelled out? No.
Because I do know, what we did as a church was we basically adopted the sexual misconduct and child and youth protection policy of the presbytery.
Yep.
As the local congregation. So I'm guessing if the presbytery developed one, that's the way that a lot of churches would go.
That would be the easy way. Yes. And then as to Mike's point, to a degree, recruiting may be a difficult thing, but now you got to spend all this time making sure that everybody is aware of all of these policies. And so now you've got, day 2 of your elder training to make sure that they all understand this. Yes, Peg.
So are there specifics that are included under what counts as a policy? I'm particularly interested in whether in an anti-racism policy that would necessarily include outlining consequences for identified racism behavior, that we would then get sessions all involved in deciding how to treat one another in light of racist behavior? Or is it just a statement against racism?
It's a policy. And so as I understand a policy, that could, I'm not going to say it automatically, but that could then remedy the issue, because your policy of sexual misconduct and your policy of child and youth protection do have what to do in instances where the policy is violated. That kind of answer your question?
Yeah, just, it seems to me that, reaching consensus about consequences for those first two, is well-known territory in a way, and, would not, be as divisive as a session trying to come up with, how we identify, forms of, the kind of racism that requires disciplinary charges and what those would be in a local church. That's all. It
Well,
seems very divisive.
that would become, in the local church, it would become a matter for that session to have to figure out. If the session didn't act upon a complaint that was filed within if it's a remedial in the 90 days, then it would go to the next hire, and our
Okay.
Presbytery Permanent Judicial Commission would hear that and then have to try to figure it out. It would be good if a policy did have explicit things. Otherwise, you're going to be reliant upon authoritative interpretations coming out as this rises through the system. And exactly, I have not looked at, I'm going to be honest, the facing racism policy that is referenced there. I did not get a chance to really read through all of that. And it could be as simple as that being what it is that we would need to implement. And there may be, what do you do in the cases of that? But I can see people having problems with defining anti-racism.
I mean, can I just add that among people who are totally against racism, I can imagine difficulties
Yes.
still in defining
And
racism.
the
And
reason I said that is I could see somebody arguing, and I'm not in a position to get into this, but somebody saying, well, I have a First Amendment right.
right, yeah,
You know, and I have been around the legal system long enough to watch all sorts of interesting things happen. So I'm not going to speak to how this would play out, but I think that oftentimes when we make amendments to the Book of Order, we don't always ponder unintended consequences or unintended complications that may arise from what we agree to do.
mhm.
Other questions? Okay. This next overture or proposed amendment is to the form of government, and it has to do with terms of call for pastors and giving more explicit oversight to the presbytery in working in instances where a pastor may leave without really desiring to. Maybe a congregation and a pastor are not a good fit. And so what do we do? So the question is, shall G 30303C in the form of government be amended as follows? Establish minimum compensation standards, including provisions for dissolution terms for pastoral calls and for those serving in temporary pastoral service, certified Christian educators, and certified associate Christian educators within the presbytery. So they're adding dissolution terms and including those who serve in a temporary pastoral service, those who are not an installed and called pastor. The General Assembly Permanent Judicial Commission had ruled that the Book of Order does not give presbyteries the power to require congregations to pay compensation upon dissolution of pastoral relationships. While guidelines and policies concerning severance for ministers at the dissolution of the pastorate, the presbytery has no authority to enforce those. This overture seeks to remedy that omission in the Book of Order by making explicit the authority of presbyteries to create and enforce severance policies by linking that authority to the power to set minimum wages and approve calls. The Administrative Committee on the Constitution has said that it would be up to a congregation to set those at the time of when somebody comes in to a call, so that 5 years in, the presbytery or the congregation does not then get saddled with a responsibility for paying some kind of severance to a pastor that they were not aware of prior. Are there questions pertaining to this? This specific amendment has 19 in favor and 14 opposed. So it's kind of that 5-1 roughly. And presbyteries, we have, I'm trying to think of the exact word. I should have written it down. I believe it's guidelines for dealing with this, because sometimes, as I said before, there are bad fits, and to just sort of have a pastor leave immediately with no form of income for a period of time can be problematic for the pastor, while also putting the burden on it. You could, through this policy, put a burden on a congregation then who loses a pastor but is still compensating them for a period of time, while also trying to then cover their own pulpit in the absence of that pastor that was just the pastoral relationship that was just dissolved. Overture 22G makes a amendment to the Book of Order, specifically to kind of that whole process of how does one become a minister in the denomination. And so the question before us, and I'll let you know that this amendment has 26 in favor and 3 against. You can see that we're getting down pretty low to those that are voting against it, but I thought that I would let you know. And this does impact those in the process of becoming ministers. So I thought it would also be good for us to be aware of what we'll be asking if this were to be passed of our inquires. So this is pertaining to the very first step in the process to becoming a minister. The question, shall G 20603 in the form of government be amended as follows? The purpose of the inquiry phase is to provide an opportunity for the church and those who believe themselves called to ordered ministry as ministers of the word and sacrament to explore that call together, so that the presbytery can make an informed decision about the inquirer's suitability for ordered ministry. They shall provide a certificate of boundary training, which includes the topic of sexual misconduct and child sexual abuse prevention training, with recertification at least every 36 months. The presbytery shall determine which trainings are approved to meet the criteria of these 2 requirements. And this time, Matt, we know who's responsible for coming up with what that training looks like. This amendment actually does that. And you'll notice that it has a recertification at least every 36 months, so that if an inquirer comes in, they would have to be certified, show that they've gone through some kind of training, and then every 36 months. So that would cover candidacy and cleared to receive a call and all the other steps before they actually became a ordained minister, at which point one of the other overtures that does require this of ministers would take over. Questions? (22C) you can see that they had a lot of business before them. It deals with the rules for discipline, and I think this would be a good time to let you know that if this, there's another overture that we'll discuss shortly, and If that one passes, then this is null and void, because one of the amendments to the Book of Order is a complete rewrite of what we now refer to as the rules of discipline. So the question before us is, shall D 30106 in the current rules of discipline be amended? And so they're going to strike the heading when jurisdiction, and then just have it to ends upon renunciation. So it's now no longer when it ends, but now it ends upon a renunciation of jurisdiction. Jurisdiction in the judicial process does not end when a person is in an ordered ministry or a member renounces the jurisdiction of the church. Should the accused in a disciplinary case renounce the jurisdiction of the church as provided in G20407 or G20509, the clerk or stated clerk shall report to the council both the renunciation and the status of the matter at that time, including the name of the accused and the date and fact of renunciation during an investigation or trial, and they're striking, and the charges filed. The judicial process shall then proceed per the rules of discipline. So as I already said, if Overture 22 G is approved, then it would replace this with what's in that overture. When we discuss 22 GG, you will not see a slide that has that overture on it, because that overture basically is about 60 pages long, because it's a complete rewrite of an entire section of the Book of Order. If renunciation takes place, the church no longer has authority over the accused or the accused any longer. Let me try that again. If somebody were to renounce their jurisdiction, the jurisdiction of the church no longer has the authority to then try them, or the accused no longer has an accountability, no longer has an accountability to the church. So there's a question of whether continuing discipline after renunciation of membership could result in liability in secular courts, and that is directly from the Advisory Committee on the Constitution. You will see the last bullet on the talking points is, in the case of an accusation of sexual abuse, if renunciation of jurisdiction takes place, then an administrative commission is formed for the sake of determining truth. And the reference to where that is in the Book of Order is G 30109B6. And as you can see, as it currently stands, the reason that this is of import is they're striking and the charges filed. Right now, if we had a disciplinary case and the investigating committee began to investigate, or if they filed charges and it went to the permanent judicial commission or session in the case of a member, and the pastor then renounced the jurisdiction of the church, what would currently happen, me as the stated clerk at a presbytery meeting would say that in the midst of this investigation or trial, Minister X renounced jurisdiction in the midst of an investigation or trial for the case of whatever it is, and would enter that into the minutes. They're trying to say that by striking and the charges filed, all I would say is that in the midst of an investigation or a trial, this pastor renounced their jurisdiction on this date. Period. So that's kind of what's at stake there, is a matter of where it is. But it would not change what we have in the Book of Order that would then say, if this was an instance of sexual abuse and somebody renounced jurisdiction, that the accuser would not then be allowed to be heard. they would go to an administrative commission who would hear the facts and seek confirmation for or non-confirmation of what the accuser is accusing. Are there questions? Mike?
Okay, so I'm trying to think of this as from the standpoint of the lay people out in the assembly. So someone is accused, a pastor is accused of sexual misconduct. And there's going to be an investigation.
Yep.
The pastor says, now I renounce jurisdiction.
Yep.
Well, maybe back up. The penalty for being found guilty is removal, disenfranchisement from being a pastor. Is that correct? Or they're great?
If the charges are filed, the permanent judicial commission, if the allegation is found to be true, the permanent judicial commission would then be charged with the resolution. There are 4 potential censures, everything from a slap on the wrist to being removed from membership of a presbytery or even membership from the church. In the case of sexual abuse, you start with level 3, what I'll refer to as level 3. It would be actually subset C, which is a temporary removal from office. That would be the minimum. It could go to them being removed from office and no longer having any pastoral opportunity.
So by renouncing jurisdiction, they're either effectively pleading guilty or they're saying, it's so muddy, I just don't want to be dragged through this. I'm done with this whole thing. I don't want to be a pastor anymore. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is whatever happens in this judicial hearing doesn't remove the ability of the accuser to pursue in civil court some sort of damage thing, which one of these, it was one of the concerns.
That would be correct. Well, the concern over there is that and bullet point 2, I can't compel you, Mike. I'm gonna pick on you because you're a member and we have a relationship to start with. But if you renounce your jurisdiction as a member of our congregation, I can send you 250 citations that you need to come to this hearing, but I have no authority to force you to come to a ecclesiastical court. The same thing holds true, but the question is, if we continued to proceed with things, somebody could, after renouncing jurisdiction in the civil courts, and I am not an attorney, they could pursue, mistreatment by the church in a civil court. That's coming out of the administrative committee, or the advisory committee, sorry, for the Constitution. And those are individuals who, for the most part, are well-versed not only in our polity, but many of the people that I have talked to that advise that administrative committee have law degrees. And so they would know a little bit better how likely or if that is even possible to happen. If a pastor were to do that, we don't have any authority to make them testify. We can't do anything. We don't have that authority. But if we continued to try them and then found them guilty even after we had no authority, the question would be, did you have any authority over me to do that? And several years ago, what had happened was we had the addition of that and the charges filed, because one of the quickest ways to stop anybody finding out what had happened was to renounce jurisdiction. Oh, we no longer have authority over you. And so they can just say, well, it's theological differences. I have a question over the Presbyterian Church's commitment to mission. And these are all things that have been used in judicial cases. And then what would happen is the presbytery would just say that this minister had, in the midst of some form of trial or investigation, renounced jurisdiction, and nobody would ever know what the case surrounded. Currently, if a charge is filed and I set up an investigative committee, what'll happen is at a presbytery meeting, if it's not resolved, I then anonymously say that I have received an allegation against minister, and this is a quote, Minister X, pertaining to issues of, and we'll just use sexual abuse because it's on the screen, regarding sexual abuse. Never named the pastor. I have to then name who's on that investigative committee. Once that is resolved, I then come out and would say that charges have been filed and this minister was found guilty of sexual abuse, and read what the outcome of the trial was. And those get entered into the minutes of the Presbyterian meeting. Yes, Jeff.
The can of worms is, once somebody renounces jurisdiction, they're no longer a member of the PCUSA. And so the question becomes, the legal question is, do we have any authority to pursue discipline against a non-member of the PCUSA?
No.
Yeah, I know, but that's what we do in essence if we were to do this.
No. If I had an administrative or a investigative committee that was investigating a case and a minister renounces jurisdiction in the case of sexual abuse, it becomes an administrative commission who hears and says, if we believe your testimony, we believe that what you say and the evidence that you have to support your allegation is accurate. We can't take any action against that minister. We don't make any pronouncement against that minister. It allows the accuser closure, especially in the case of sexual abuse, because what we've seen over and over and over again is the accuser never getting their closure to the allegations or to what they've gone through. And so if it was an issue of anything but sexual abuse is really the only time that we could then continue with an administrative commission seeking true or determining truth. Yes, Mike.
So the question is about degrees of closure. I mean, if the person is no longer a Presbyterian minister, that could be a form of closure, but
no, because then to be told, we believe that you were sexually abused. And let's see. This has been going on. These issues have been going on for years. Before General Assembly, we've had discussions about getting the closure for individuals, and survivors of sexual abuse have said to be heard and be told, we believe you, is what will provide the closure for them, rather than the church in essence saying, no, we can't do anything. We can't even hear that because they are no longer a pastor of our church, especially in the case of renouncing jurisdiction in the midst of a case. And so it's allowing them to be heard is what it's doing, basically. There can't be repercussions. If a pastor were to go through a sexual abuse case, there are, and only in the case of sexual abuse, a fine or something could be levied against that pastor, that they have to then help compensate an individual for their counseling or other things that they've had to endure as a result of the trauma. Side note, if a pastor were to renounce their jurisdiction, there would be tax implications for them. And with all of this, whenever a pastor renounces jurisdiction, one of the things to keep in mind is that the only way for them to ever be reinstated is they'd have to come back to the presbytery where they renounced their jurisdiction or renounced the jurisdiction of the church. And if there was a trial or an investigation in place, the investigation would pick up exactly where it left off. As the stated clerk, I'm obligated to then put those into a file and keep them till at least Jesus comes back. When Jesus comes back, I probably won't be the stated clerk, and I will leave that file cabinet where it is. It used to be believed that renunciation of jurisdiction was a way to avoid investigation, and you could just pop up years later. And over the years, through actions of General Assembly, they've been looking at ways to close the back door. And in any time jurisdiction is renounced, I have to report that to General Assembly so that they would also have a record of where that minister would need to go if they ever wanted to be restored. The next, as I said, Overture 22 GG states a complete rewrite of the rules of discipline. That's page 64 through 128 of that proposed amendments. So if 22 GG, which has it had 19 in favor, 1 against, so it's probably going to pass. Then all the other overtures that deal with anything in the rules of discipline would be answered by this amendment, the complete rewrite of the rules of discipline, or what they're referring to as church discipline. And the aim of the overture, this GG, is to make the rules of discipline more accessible to the church, to preserve and enhance the accountability of councils and individuals to the church, to expand the opportunities of mediation and alternative dispute resolution, and to provide flexibility in crafting censures and remedies, particularly in light of recent learnings in ethical and social development and experiments by the secular legal system with alternative sentencing. Right now, we have 4 options of what we do if somebody was found guilty of charges. In this new church discipline, as they refer to it, there would be more flexibility when it comes to that. And then the last 2 that I have here deal with house worship. And this one was a little interesting to me. When I was going back through the tallies of votes, this one had 2 votes, so I put it on there. Y has to deal with adding adding this paragraph, which is a 3rd paragraph to it. And I don't see anything in this that was controversial. How many of you knew that we had a section in our directory of worship for house worship? Well, I see some ministers and commissioned ruling elders. I think that there are a lot of people that don't even know this exists in that book of order. And then the last one is weird, really weird to me. 3 presbyteries have voted against this, with 32 voting in favor of it. And it's a very long paragraph. So I brought down, because ordination only takes place once for each office. The laying on of hands is not repeated if you're just installing. Those previously ordained will stand, if able, along with the congregation for the prayer of installation. Signs and symbols of blessing may be conferred on the newly installed or commissioned person. After this, the moderator makes the determination of ordination, installation, or commissioning. I brought that before you just because it had 3 people voting against it, and every other, or 3 presbyteries, and every other overture that had 3 or more, I brought to your attention. I don't have any comment on this one. And there wasn't a lot of controversy about, I mean, explanation or the advisory committees weighing in on this one either. But that's that. Are there any final questions?
On anything or this particular overture?
Well, on anything.
I'd just like to say, it's not a question, but I'd like to say that you did a great job of putting this out here and making it clear and understandable. So thank you for that. That was
You're
a
welcome.
job well done, in my opinion.
And again, if you are reading through that book of proposed amendments when you can't sleep at night and you have a question about another amendment or something, feel free to reach out to me. My email is revbrinegar, BRINEGAR @gmail.com. And I'd be willing to talk to you about what may be behind that, how that might impact the presbytery or a local church or something else. But there's a lot of these overtures that as of now have 0 presbyteries that have voted against them. And you can imagine that I will put those on a consent agenda after consulting with our commissioners from this General Assembly about what they think could be placed on a consent agenda versus what we should discuss. But no, regardless of if it's on the consent agenda or not, it can always be pulled off. My ability to speak intelligently to some things that may get pulled off the consent agenda might be limited, but I'll do my best. If we pull something off there and I'm having to scramble to read it and try to offer an immediate interpretation.
You can do it. You can do it. We know you can do it.
Well, thank you.
So Blake,
Yeah,
will you, as stated clerk, will you give any guidance to the assembly or information about, or this information about how other presbyteries have voted? Or will you just lay it out there and people vote?
I'll work with the polity committee and we may come up with advice, because every one of those amendments or proposed amendments in that huge document do have advice from different advisory committees. But one of the things that's important for us to remember is that as commissioners, we are to vote the will of Christ as we see it in that moment. And so if people had questions about implementation or other things, I would be more than willing to be called upon to try to explain what this would look like if it was passed or not passed. And by the March meeting, I should have another update as to how the amendments are going, and I can share that. I don't know that we might be able to do it in the slideshow, actually, just sort of how it's being voted on throughout the denomination. But I work at the will of the body. And so it is the assembly gets to determine how much I speak or how little I speak. So.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yep. And Jeff put in the chat the link to getting that whole book of proposed amendments if you haven't. Any other questions? Yes, Peg.
Yeah, Blake, if I read through the materials, will I find a defense of having the boundaries thing done at the inquirer stage as compared to the candidate stage. I'm just wondering, it seems to me, compared to when I worked at Hendricks and worked with Methodist students that were looking at ministry, it seems like we sometimes put a lot of bureaucracy in the way of people follow their early excitement about the call. So I'm just wondering why do they don't have responsibility over anybody unless there'd been a youth director, and then they would have to go through it if other things are passed. So anyway, why?
Actually, right now, a youth pastor could dodge it if they're not a.
No, I mean, but it looks like well, maybe that's right. I was thinking if we passed other things. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there is another amendment that has had no opposition, that once a committee on preparation for ministry has pastors or not pastors, inquirers or candidates under their care, anybody under their care, that if they receive any indication that an impropriety has taken place, they are to report that, which just further cements something that I have a feeling the Committee on Preparation for Ministry would probably address within the committee, stating, we don't think you're called for ministry because you just did X, Y, and Z, or we recommend that you go get counseling or some other form of a resolution. But I'm trying to think off the top of my head, if in that amendment there was a dissent, and do you remember what number that was? Sorry.
$22G.
Yep, 22G. I'm going to look real fast.
Okay.
No, there's no dissents. The groups are affirming the need to have this in place at this point. And I don't know that necessarily, I understand where you're coming from with burdening somebody who's just thinking about it and they have to go through the boundary training. I think in the minds of others, if somebody were to start the process of inquiry and go through boundaries training, that would serve them well in whatever it is that they did in life. That's me speaking off the cuff.
I understand.
So.
Thanks.
So if there's nothing else, that's more than I know.
Like this is Ruskin. Excuse me, this is Ruskin. I just want to just put in that I understand this is really burdensome, 33 amendments to have to consider. And so, I know there may be, we may need to find a way around having to go through all these things. At the same time, I'm skeptical of just throwing stuff onto the consent agenda, or saying just because a majority of presbyteries have already voted yes or no, that we're going to let that slide through as our vote. And I'm also skeptical of people leaving the meeting and not knowing diddly squat about what we just put into our, I mean, this is the Constitution, and we're involved also right now in the struggle against things that are going on in our society. But this is also what you were saying at the start. This is also, after we whittle down, we tried to get away from micromanagement of our theology and everything else, and social positions. And this is now starting to go back where you're going to start getting thicker books of order. And I think you know that. I just want to throw that in.
Okay. Yeah. And that's, I pulled, like I said, I was just utilizing the discernment of the body as a way to try to address where I thought there might be discussion pertaining to that. And there may be discussion on some of these other amendments. And one of the things with that packet out ahead of time is people would have the opportunity, and we would have that link in that packet as to where they could find these and what's on there. if somebody wanted to scan through them. I know that A and B are just changing from men, women, and children to persons. And some of it is grammatical or structure kinds of things to include a variety of individuals. So, but yes, Jeff.
Well, yeah, the whole document, I think 68 pages, double-sided. But I noticed a couple of presbyteries that as I was looking for this one had done sent out a summary. They had all the things with just a little, this one's about this one's about this.
Yeah.
That might be helpful. It can be overwhelming to me, and especially a ruling elder looks at that 68-page document to know where to even start. That would allow them to kind of say, oh, this is one that I want to know more about.
Yeah, and we can do that. And I have access to some of those. One of the documents was, I think, 17 pages long that was trying to give a brief summary. And I started that way, trying to summarize all of them. And I went, how many hours do people want to listen to me talk? Matt.
So there's 33 of these. What's the deadline for this? And is it possible to split it up between meetings? Or is
The
that
deadline
just-
is July 9th or 19th. It has a 9 in it. So we would have the March meeting, and we do technically have the June meeting, which is a Zoom meeting that we have to do that. So
I just didn't know if that would make it easier.
well, at one point I had asked how many meetings are we going to take to get through 33. So, and that may be a continued conversation that is had regarding this Presbytery meeting. Other questions, comments, thoughts?
Well done.
Well, thank you. And went a little bit longer than I anticipated, but the conversation, the questions that you were asking were good questions. And they are questions that are shared by pastoral leaders throughout the denomination. I didn't hear anything new today in your concerns. So.
Well, everyone go in peace. The blessings of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer be with you all now and forever. Thank you for coming today.
You're welcome.